Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Wallen, and I am a student at Regent University. And I put together a presentation for one of my classes, which is COM 710, Communication in a Global Environment. And today I'm going to be discussing a chapter from a book. And so it will be Chapter 9, The Influence of Contextual Factors and the Selection of News Frames, a cross-national approach to the news coverage of severe acute respiratory syndrome. As you can see, this is the presentation outline. I want to give you just a quick overview of everything that I'm going to be covering in this presentation. So we have 8 points to cover total. I'm going to be going over the reference information. I'm going to expand on some background information before we get to the research purpose and question. Then we'll talk a little bit about the conceptual framework. We're going to detail about the data collection methods, sampling procedures. Then we'll also talk about data analysis methods, finding conclusions, and then I will give you my final critique. The first thing that I want to go over is the reference information, because you're probably wondering, where did I get this chapter from, right? So this particular chapter came from a book called International Media Communication in a Global Age, which was edited by Golan, Johnson, and Wanta. This particular chapter that I will be going over is a research that was conducted by Chang, Salmon, Lee, Choi, and Zeldes. Okay, let's get started with point number 2, which is background information. And so why did the researchers begin the study? What was the problem that they found in the literature, and why did they decide to do the study, right? So the problem statement, according to Chang and Associates, is that there is no empirical evidence that has been collected about specific factors that lead to corresponding media frames. What does it all mean? What do we make out of that? And so they're basically saying that popular contextual factors like political or economic conditions and press freedom have always been studied extensively and shown to influence news content. However, news frames have not been studied. Before we go into detail about the study, I just want to quickly go over media frames and what it all means, because we can say, I know what media frames are, but it's not until you really get into the details and understand the topic well that you're able to make the connections later on. The media frames are defined as persistent selection, emphasis, and exclusion of news that enable journalists to process large amounts of information quickly and routinely package the information for efficient relay to their audiences. Why are media frames important? Number 1, they demonstrate very specific perspectives that help convey the power a story has in reporting the news. Number 2, media frames allow us to explore how specific devices can shape our understanding of the topic itself. And number 3, media frames are also important because they set the parameters of the discussion. So the words, symbols over a content, and the tone used to frame the topic. And number 4, media frames affect our cognitive processes such as moral evaluations, causal reasoning, appeals to principles, and recommendations for treatment of problems. Why do journalists use media frames? This is a very complex question, but just to put it plain and simple, journalists use frames to help break down complex information into easy-to-understand content for public consumption. The only problem with that is that they do so with their own frame. They use their experience and their own lens to deliver the content. These are some examples of media framing, just to get you thinking before we go back to the study. So some of the examples are undocumented worker versus illegal alien, pro-choice versus pro-abortion, homosexual marriage versus gay marriage, special rights versus equal rights. So just keep this in the back of your mind as we start talking about the study. Okay, point number 3 is research purpose. What are Chang and Associates trying to do? So the research purpose is to conduct a cross-national study examining what and how news frames were adopted in mainstream newspapers in SARS-infected nations. They also analyze and compare news frames within each country and examine contextual factors that may influence the selection of news frames regarding this issue of international consequence. Research questions. So this article has a total of 4 research questions. Number 1 is, which nation has dedicated more news space to the STARS issue? Number 2, what is the dominant news frames of STARS coverage in the 6 countries? Number 3, how would political control be associated with the use of the threat to government credibility news frame? And number 4, how would political control be associated with the use of the individual survival or heroic action news frame? Research hypothesis. Number 1, the greater the economy of the nation, the more likely the threat to economy news frames would be used in its newspapers. Number 2, the more STARS cases the nation reported, the more likely the threat to public health news frames would be used in its newspapers. Point number 4 is the conceptual framework, and it is quite evident that the authors presented a clear synthesis of the literature, thus explaining the phenomenon and the lack of research to date. Let's talk about point number 5, which is the data collection method. And let's focus on the measurement that they created, because it includes 8 types of news frames. And you've probably heard of these before, but these are central to the study, basically looking at news that were disseminated for STARS. So these are very, very specific to the research question and the research hypothesis. And so the 8 types of news frames include threat to the economy, public health, government credibility, national or racial relations, international aid, joint efforts on controlling the disease, medical investigation, individual survival, or heroic stories. And then anything that doesn't fall under those 8 are considered others. Another part of the data collection method that is really important to mention is the time frame of the study, which covered 4 months of news coverage on SARS. Even though the disease originated in southern China around November of 2002, the news didn't pick up on the issue until later on. And so because of this, the researchers decided to include news stories from March 1st, 2003, all the way up until June 30th, 2003. Okay, moving on to point number 6, sampling procedures. As you can see, the researchers selected 6 newspapers from 6 nations ranging from Canada, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and the United States. The rationale selection for newspapers is very simple and straightforward. They were basically looking for newspapers that had large circulation. Asian nations identified had to be SARS-infected nations. And then for the United States and Canada newspapers, they had to be headquartered in big Chinese populations. And with that, they ended up finding 1,464 issues, and 122 were covered in each newspaper. Point number 7, data analysis methods. The researchers used content analysis to review all of the issues covered in the newspapers. An intercoded reliability test was conducted by 3 groups. Each group had 2 coders, and then this was done to overcome the geographic and language barriers. And it was actually pretty interesting because one group coded the US and Canadian newspapers, and then group number 2 coded the Chinese language Asian newspapers, and then the last group coded the English language Asian newspapers. At the end, an intercoder reliability test was assessed, and they reached an acceptable agreement of 0.90 or higher. So that was actually pretty good. Moving on to final point, number 8, the findings. The first research question asked which nation has dedicated more news space to the SARS issue. And so the researchers actually took 2 approaches to this question, and for news coverage of SARS in the front page, section 1, standalone photos and standalone photos plus section 1, it looks like Taiwan's United Daily was the one that dedicated the most news space. But then when you looked at the percentage of the news sites on the front page, the results were completely different, and it was actually pretty telling because at 47.73, Canada's Toronto Star covered the most on the stars issue, and for China's People's Daily, only 6.3% was allotted. So this actually kind of tells us that China did cover the issue, but maybe it just seemed to downplay its importance. Okay, let's quickly wrap up with all of the research questions. Number 2, apparently the threat to public health was the dominant news frame in all countries. For research question number 3, political control is negatively associated with the use of the threat to government credibility. And this is mainly because the Chinese daily helped cover up the disease and remain quiet about its government wrongdoing. For research question number 4, political control is negatively associated with the use of individual survival or heroic action news frames, because while the heroic frame works in countries like the United States, it doesn't always work with the Chinese elite press. As far as hypotheses, it looks like both of them were rejected and therefore not supported, which means that the greater the economy of the country or the more cases that were reported didn't really have that much of an influence. My final critique of the study is that it provides an excellent contribution to the literature. I think it would be a great idea to replicate this study and actually use COVID-19 to see if we get the same result. That is a wrap. Thank you so much for watching.